The summer heat of 1883 beat down on Ash Fork, Arizona, like a hammer on an anvil, and Clara Ramsey stood behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, pouring whiskey for the 15th cowboy that day who looked at her like she was water in the desert. She was 23 years old, auburn-haired, green-eyed, and the only unmarried woman left in a town where the railroad had brought 100 men and taken away every family that had sense enough to leave. The drought had killed the dreams of farmers, the mines had played out, and what remained was a collection of dusty souls too stubborn or too broken to move on. Clara wiped down the bar with a rag that had seen better days, her calloused hands moving in practiced circles. She had inherited the saloon from her father 6 months ago when pneumonia took him in the spring. Before that, she had helped him run the place since her mother died giving birth to a stillborn brother when Clara was 12. She knew every knot in the wooden floorboards, every bullet hole in the tin ceiling, every story behind every stain. This place was her prison and her kingdom both. "Miss Clara," drawled Buck Henderson, a ranch hand with more swagger than sense, "when you going to let me take you to dinner?" "I got paid yesterday and I am feeling mighty generous." She did not look up from the bar. "Buck, we both know the only restaurant in town is Mrs. Chen's boarding house, and she stopped serving dinner 3 weeks ago when her stove broke. Besides, I have told you a dozen times I am not interested." 2 other cowboys at a corner table laughed, but not unkindly. Everyone in Ash Fork had tried their luck with Clara Ramsey at some point. She had turned down proposals from ranch owners, drifters, a circuit preacher who came through twice a year, and even the deputy sheriff before he got shot in a dispute over a card game. The men did not understand why she said no. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She had a sharpness to her, an intelligence in her eyes that made them feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and uncomfortable. What they did not know was that Clara Ramsey had dreams bigger than this dying town. She read books that came in on the train, novels about cities back east, about women who attended universities, who wrote for newspapers, who lived lives of the mind. She taught herself mathematics from her father's old ledgers and could calculate profit margins faster than any man in the territory. She wrote poetry in the margins of recipe books and hid them under the floorboards beneath her bed. She wanted more than to be someone's wife in a town slowly being reclaimed by the desert. The door swung open, and a stranger walked in, bringing with him a gust of hot wind and red dust. Clara looked up, as did every other person in the saloon. Strangers were common enough in Ash Fork, as it sat along the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad line, but this man was different. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt that sat easy on his hips, but there was something quiet about him, something that suggested he carried the weight of thought rather than the weight of violence. He walked to the bar without looking at anyone else and set down a silver dollar. "Whiskey, please, and information if you are selling it." Clara poured him a glass and slid it across the wood. "Information depends on what you are asking. The whiskey is 2 bits." He took a sip and did not grimace the way most men did at her father's rot gut. "I am looking for work." "Ranch work, preferably. Heard there might be outfits hiring in this area." Buck Henderson laughed from behind him. "You heard wrong, friend. The drought killed half the cattle in the territory. Ranches are laying men off, not hiring them." The stranger did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Clara. "That's so," she nodded. "He is right. Times are hard. Most spreads are running skeleton crews. You might have better luck in Flagstaff or down in Prescott. Appreciate the honesty." He finished his whiskey and set the glass down gently. "I am Xander Moss." I will be around town a few days, see if anything turns up. If you hear of anything, I would be obliged if you pass the word." Clara found herself studying his face. He had a scar above his left eyebrow and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun, but there was something else there too. A sadness maybe, or a weariness that went deeper than hard travel. She realized she was staring and looked away. "I will keep my ears open." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture so old-fashioned and courteous that it seemed out of place in the rough saloon, and walked out into the brutal afternoon sun. Buck Henderson whistled low. Another drifter. Town's full of them. But Clara barely heard him. She was thinking about the way Xander Moss had looked at her. Not with the hungry desperation of the other men, not with the assumption that she was a prize to be won. He had looked at her like she was a person, someone whose opinion mattered, someone worth listening to. It had been so brief, so simple, and yet it had struck her as profoundly unusual. That evening, as she closed up the saloon, she found herself wondering where Xander Moss was spending the night. The boarding house, probably, if Mrs. Chen had room. She locked the doors and walked upstairs to the small apartment above the bar where she lived. 3 rooms that smelled of tobacco smoke and old wood, filled with her father's things that she had not had the heart to clear out. She made herself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, then sat by the window with a book, but the words would not stick. Her mind kept wandering to winter blue eyes and a quiet voice that asked questions instead of making demands. She told herself it was foolishness. He was a drifter, just like a dozen others who passed through every month. He would move on in a few days and she would never see him again. There was no point in letting her imagination spin stories about a stranger. But that night, she dreamed of wide open spaces and a man riding beside her toward a horizon that never grew closer. The next morning, Clara was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the saloon when she saw Xander Moss walking down the street. He noticed her and changed direction, crossing the dusty road to tip his hat again. "Miss Ramsey," he said. She stopped sweeping. "You learned my name?" asked Mrs. Chen. "Hope that does not offend." "Why would it? Everyone in town knows who I am." She tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice, but was not entirely successful. He studied her face for a moment. Must be difficult, being the center of that much attention. His words surprised her so much that she forgot to guard her expression. Most men do not see it that way. Most men do not think past what they want. He glanced down the street toward the railroad depot. "I am heading out to the Carmichael place. Heard they might need someone to help repair their well. Not ranch work, but it is something. The Carmichael place is 8 miles south. Road is rough." "I have walked rougher." She set her broom against the wall. "Mr. Moss, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why Ash Fork? If you are looking for work, there are better towns, bigger towns." He was quiet for a moment and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Sometimes a man needs to be somewhere that does not ask too many questions about where he has been." She understood that. She did not press further. "Well, good luck with the Carmichaels. Old Henry is fair, but his son Tom is sharp on the deal. Do not let him low-ball you on the wage." Xander Moss smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "Appreciate the advice." He walked away, and Clara watched him go, feeling something shift inside her chest like a door opening in a house that had been locked up too long. The days turned into a week. Xander Moss did not leave Ash Fork. He found work where he could find it, odd jobs that kept him fed and paid for his room at the boarding house. He fixed the Carmichael well, repaired a section of fence for the Johnsons, helped the blacksmith shoe horses when his back gave him trouble. Word got around that he was a good worker, reliable and skilled. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble, did not start fights. In a town full of rough men, he stood out for his quietness. And every evening, he came to the Silver Dollar Saloon for one whiskey, which he drank slowly at the bar while Clara worked. They did not talk much at first. He seemed content to sit in silence, and she was busy serving the other customers. But gradually, in the small spaces between pouring drinks and washing glasses, they began to exchange words. "Where are you from?" she asked him on the third night. "Kansas originally, been a lot of places since. Family, had a brother. He died at Antietam." He said it matter-of-factly, but she heard the old grief underneath. "I am sorry. Long time ago, I was just a kid." He took a sip of whiskey. "What about you? You grow up here, born in Missouri." "My parents brought me out here when I was 7. My father thought he could make a fortune in cattle." She smiled without humor. "He was wrong, but you stayed." "Where else would I go?" He looked at her directly then, and she felt the weight of his attention. "Anywhere you wanted, I would guess. You do not seem like someone who scares easy." It was the most personal thing anyone had said to her in months, maybe years. The other men talked at her, made assumptions about her, projected their fantasies onto her. But Xander Moss asked questions and listened to the answers as if they mattered. "What makes you say that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "The way you handle the drunks, the way you run this place by yourself, the way you look at the horizon like you are measuring the distance to somewhere else." He finished his whiskey and stood. "Good night, Miss Ramsey." After he left, Clara stood alone in the empty saloon and pressed her palm flat against the bar, feeling the solid wood beneath her hand, grounding herself in reality. She was developing feelings for this man. She could admit that much to herself. And that terrified her because feelings led to expectations, and expectations led to disappointment. Every man in this town wanted to own her in one way or another. What if Xander Moss was no different? What if she was just fooling herself, seeing something in him that was not really there? But the next night he came back, and the next, and slowly, carefully, they began to build something between them that felt different from anything Clara had known before. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. 2 weeks after Xander Moss arrived in Ash Fork, the situation came to a head. It was a Saturday night, and the saloon was crowded. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches had ridden in for their weekly drunk, and the air was thick with tobacco smoke and loud voices. Clara was pouring drinks as fast as she could, and Xander was at his usual spot at the end of the bar, nursing his one whiskey and reading a battered copy of Whitman's poetry he had borrowed from Mrs. Chen. Buck Henderson had been drinking since noon and was well past the point of sense. He stumbled up to the bar and slapped his hand down hard. "Clara, darling, I have been thinking." "That is never a good sign, Buck," she said, not looking up from the beer she was pouring. "No, no, listen." He swayed on his feet. "You and me, we should get hitched. I am serious. I got a job at the Triple Bar, steady wages. I could take care of you. You would not have to work no more. Buck, you are drunk. Go sit down. I am serious." His voice rose loud enough that conversation around the saloon started to die down. "Every man in this town has asked you proper, and you turned us all down. What are you waiting for? You think you are too good for us." Clara set down the beer and met his eyes. "Buck, I have told you before, I am not interested in getting married. Not to you, not to anyone. Now please go sit down before you embarrass yourself further. You need a man to take care of you. This place is falling apart. Look at you, working yourself to death. It ain't right." "What is not right," Clara said coldly, "is you telling me what I need." "I have been taking care of myself just fine." Buck's face flushed red. "You are being foolish. A woman alone," the lady said no. Xander Moss's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He had not raised his volume, but there was steel in his tone that made everyone in the saloon go quiet. He had stood up from his seat and was facing Buck, his body relaxed but his eyes hard. Buck whirled around. "This ain't your business, Drifter. You are making a scene in a place of business. That makes it everyone's business. I am talking to Clara. No, you are harassing her. There is a difference." Buck took a step toward Xander, his fists clenched. He had 4 inches and 30 pounds on the quiet stranger. "You want to take this outside?" Clara came around the bar fast. "Stop it, both of you. Buck, go home, sleep it off." But Buck was not listening. The alcohol and the humiliation had mixed into something ugly. "I am tired of being polite. I am tired of asking. You are going to listen to me, Clara." He reached for her arm, and that was when Xander moved. He was fast, faster than Clara would have guessed. He stepped between them and caught Buck's wrist, twisting it just enough to break his grip. "Touch her and we will have a problem." For a moment, the whole saloon held its breath. Buck was bigger, but Xander had the look of someone who had been in more than a few fights and survived them all. The math was not clear. Then the sheriff walked in. He was an old man named Garrett who had held the position for 20 years through sheer stubbornness. "What is going on here?" "Nothing, Sheriff," Clara said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." Garrett looked at Buck, then at Xander, then at Clara. He had known her since she was a child. "That right, Buck?" Buck jerked his arm free from Xander's grip and stepped back. "Yeah, misunderstanding. I was just leaving." He stumbled toward the door and disappeared into the night. The tension in the saloon broke and conversation slowly resumed. Garrett nodded to Clara and walked back out. Xander returned to his seat at the bar. Clara poured him another whiskey without asking and set it in front of him. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Thank you." "You do not have to thank me." "Yes, I do. Buck has been pushing boundaries for months. It was going to come to a head eventually." Xander looked at her and she saw concern in his eyes. "Does that happen a lot? Men pushing often enough?" She kept her voice neutral. "It is part of running a saloon in a town like this. You should not have to deal with that." "Well, I do." She heard the sharpness in her tone and softened it. "I appreciate what you did, but I can handle Buck Henderson." "I know you can. That is not why I stepped in." He took a sip of the whiskey. "I stepped in because you should not have to handle it alone, not when there are people around who can help." Something in Clara's chest cracked open. She had been alone for so long, handling everything by herself, that the simple offer of help felt almost overwhelming. She blinked hard and turned away, busying herself with wiping down the bar. "Mr. Moss," she said after a moment, "why are you still in Ash Fork?" "Work." "There is no work here, not real work. You are doing odd jobs for pennies." "A man with your skills could find steady work in a dozen other towns." He was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, very softly, "Maybe I found a reason to stay." Her heart hammered in her chest. She looked at him and he looked back, and in that moment the noise of the saloon faded away. It was just the two of them, the space between them charged with possibility. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Would you take a walk with me tomorrow? During the day, somewhere public. I just want to talk to you without a bar between us and a room full of drunk cowboys around us." She should say no. She should protect herself. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "Yes." "Tomorrow after church, let's out. Meet me here." He smiled, that rare smile that transformed his face. "Tomorrow, then." That night Clara could not sleep. She lay in her bed above the saloon, listening to the distant sounds of the railroad and the wind moving through the cottonwoods by the creek, and let herself imagine what it might be like to be with someone who saw her, really saw her, for who she was. The next morning, she dressed carefully in her one good dress, a simple cotton thing the color of sage that her mother had made years ago. She pinned her hair up and looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand. Her face was too thin, she thought, and her hands too rough. But her eyes were bright, and her cheeks were flushed, and for the first time in a long time, she looked happy. She did not go to church. She had stopped attending regularly after her father died, finding no comfort in Reverend Thompson's fire and brimstone sermons. But she waited outside the saloon as the church bells rang noon, and when Xander Moss came walking down the street in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing, her breath caught in her throat. "Miss Ramsey," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Moss." They started walking, heading out of the main street toward the edge of town where a few scraggly cottonwoods grew along the dry creek bed. It was not much, but it was the closest thing Ash Fork had to a park. For a while they walked in silence. Then Xander said, "Tell me about your dreams." The question startled her. "My dreams, what you want, for your life. If you could do anything, be anywhere, what would it look like?" No one had ever asked her that. She stopped walking and looked at him. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to know you. The real you, not the version everyone in town sees." Clara took a breath. It felt dangerous exposing herself like this, but she also felt a desperate need to tell someone, to speak her secret hopes out loud. "I want to learn. I want to go to a city and take classes. Literature, maybe, or business. I want to see an opera and visit a library with 10,000 books. I want to write things that matter and have people read them. I want more than just surviving." She laughed, a brittle sound. "I know it is foolish. Women like me do not get those chances." "It is not foolish." His voice was firm. "And you are not like anyone else. Why do you think you do not deserve those things?" "Because this is the world we live in. Women do not go to universities. They get married and have children and keep house. And I am not saying there is anything wrong with that for women who want it. But I want something different, and wanting something different does not change reality." They had reached the cottonwoods. A few birds sang in the branches, and the shade was a relief from the relentless sun. Xander gestured to a flat rock and they sat down, the stone still cool from the night. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course. I left Kansas because I killed a man." Clara went very still. "What?" "He was a foreman on a ranch where I worked. He was beating a horse, beating it so bad I knew it was going to die. I told him to stop. He pulled a gun on me. I was faster." He looked at his hands. It was ruled self-defense, but his family was powerful. They made it clear I needed to leave and not come back. So I have been drifting for 3 years, working where I can, moving on before anyone asks too many questions. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know who I am. I am not a saint. I have done things I regret. But I am also not the kind of man who stands by and watches someone get hurt when I can do something about it. That is why I stepped in with Buck last night. And that is why I am telling you now that if you want those dreams, you should chase them. Do not let this town trap you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "It is not that simple." "I know it is not. But Clara, you are extraordinary. You are smart and capable, and you deserve a life bigger than pouring whiskey for cowboys who do not appreciate you. If you want to go to a city and learn and write, then find a way to do it. I have responsibilities. The saloon, sell it. It is all I have." "No." He looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "You have yourself. That is more than enough." She started to cry then, not from sadness but from the sheer relief of being seen. Xander reached over and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands under the cottonwood trees while the birds sang and the world turned beneath them. "Xander," she said finally, "what do you want? What are your dreams?" He smiled a little sadly. "Honestly, I have been drifting so long I forgot I was allowed to want anything. But sitting here with you, I am starting to remember. I want a place to belong. I want to wake up in the morning and know that I am building something, not just passing through. I want someone to come home to at the end of the day, someone who challenges me and makes me laugh and sees through my defenses. He squeezed her hand. I think maybe I want you. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. We barely know each other. I know. But I have never met anyone like you, and I think if we gave this a chance, it could be something real. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt, but the cautious, scared part of her was still holding back. What if it does not work? What if you decide I am not worth the trouble, Clara? He said her name like a prayer. You are worth everything. She kissed him then, leaning across the space between them and pressing her lips to his. It was clumsy and tentative and perfect. He kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle and reverent. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Okay, she whispered. Let us try. Over the next weeks, they fell in love the way wildflowers bloom after a rain, fast and fierce and beautiful. Xander found steady work at the livery stable, and every evening he came to the saloon to sit at the bar and talk to Clara while she worked. They talked about everything: books they had read, places they had been, dreams they had buried. He told her about growing up in Kansas with a brother who wanted to be a doctor, about the war that took him and left a hole that never healed. She told him about her mother, who had played piano and taught Clara to read before she could walk, about the loneliness of growing up in a dying town with no one who understood her. On Sundays, they took long walks together, exploring the desert around Ash Fork. He showed her how to find water in dry creek beds and how to read animal tracks in the dust. She showed him the places she had loved as a child: a small canyon where the rocks made strange echoes, a plateau where you could see for miles in every direction. They held hands and kissed under the wide sky, and Clara felt herself opening up like a flower that had been closed too long. The town noticed, of course. Ash Fork was too small for anything to stay secret. The other men grumbled but mostly kept their distance, especially after Buck Henderson left town to work on a ranch in New Mexico. There were a few snide comments, a few knowing looks, but for the most part people let them be. Sheriff Garrett actually smiled when he saw them together, and Mrs. Chen started making extra dumplings when she knew Xander would be coming by for dinner. One evening, as Clara was closing up the saloon, Xander came in looking troubled. She knew immediately something was wrong. What happened? She asked. Got a telegram today, from Kansas. He handed her the paper and she read it quickly. His brother's widow was sick, dying, and she wanted to see him. She had 2 children and no one else to care for them. Clara's stomach dropped. When do you leave? Train tomorrow. I will be gone at least a few weeks, maybe longer depending on what I find when I get there. He took both her hands in his. Come with me. Xander, I cannot just leave. Why not? You keep saying you want to see more of the world. This is a chance. The saloon will still be here when we get back. Or you can sell it and never come back. Either way, come with me. I do not want to do this without you. Clara looked around the saloon at the familiar walls that had been her whole world for so long. She thought about her father, about the years she had spent taking care of him in this place. And then she thought about what Xander had said weeks ago under the cottonwood trees: you have yourself, and that is more than enough. Okay, she said, I will come with you. His face lit up. Really? Really? Give me 2 days to arrange things. I will ask Mrs. Chen's nephew to watch the saloon. He has been looking for work. Xander pulled her into his arms and kissed her hard. Thank you. Thank you for taking a chance on me. You took a chance on me first, she said against his lips. They left Ash Fork on a Tuesday morning, boarding the eastbound train as the sun rose red and gold over the desert. Clara had one bag with her clothes and a small wooden box that held her mother's jewelry and the poems she had written over the years. Everything else she left behind. The journey to Kansas took 3 days. They sat together on hard wooden seats, watching the landscape change from desert to prairie, talking and dozing and reading from the book of Whitman poems they shared. At night, they stayed in different boarding houses, maintaining propriety, but Clara found herself lying awake thinking about the feel of his hand in hers, the warmth of his body next to hers on the train. When they arrived in Topeka, they took a stagecoach to the small farming town where Xander's brother had settled. The house was a modest wood frame structure surrounded by wheat fields. A thin woman answered the door, and Clara knew immediately she was looking at someone who did not have long. She was pale and drawn, and her cough rattled in her chest. "Xander," she said, and then she was crying and hugging him, and 2 small children appeared behind her, a boy of about 7 and a girl of maybe 5. "Annie, this is Clara," Xander said. "Clara, this is Annie, my sister-in-law. And these are Thomas and Elizabeth." Annie looked at Clara with a mixture of relief and wariness. "He wrote that he met someone. I am glad he was not alone." Over the next days, the situation became clear. Annie had tuberculosis, and the doctor gave her weeks at best. She had been trying to manage the farm and care for the children alone, but she was failing fast. She wanted Xander to take the children, to give them a home and a future. Clara watched Xander with Thomas and Elizabeth, saw how gentle he was with them, how patient. The boy was quiet and serious, grieving for a father he barely remembered and a mother he was about to lose. The girl was too young to fully understand, but she clung to her mother and cried when Annie coughed too hard. One night after the children were asleep, Clara and Xander sat on the porch while Annie rested inside. "I cannot leave them," Xander said. "She has no one else. If I do not take them, they will end up in an orphanage. I know. That means staying here at least for a while. The farm is small, but it is paid for. I could work it, give them a stable home." He looked at her. "But that is not the life you wanted. Cities and libraries and universities. I will understand if you want to go back to Arizona." Clara took his hand. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? That sometimes a man needs to be somewhere that does not ask questions about where he has been." "Yes. Maybe I need to be somewhere that does not ask questions about where I am going. Maybe I need to stop running from what I have and start building something real." She squeezed his fingers. "I want to stay with you, with them." He kissed her then, deep and grateful. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." Annie died on a Sunday morning with Xander holding one hand and Clara holding the other. They buried her next to her husband in a small cemetery outside town, and Thomas stood dry-eyed while Elizabeth sobbed into Clara's skirt. After the funeral, they went back to the house and began the process of becoming a family. It was not easy. Thomas was angry and grieving, lashing out in the way children do when the world stops making sense. Elizabeth had nightmares and wet the bed. Clara, who had never cared for children, felt lost and overwhelmed. But Xander was steady, and together they fumbled through it. They established routines: breakfast at sunrise, lessons in the afternoon, stories before bed. Clara taught Elizabeth to read and Thomas to do sums. Xander taught them both to ride and to plant and to fix things that broke. And slowly, day by day, they became something like a family. One evening, 3 months after they arrived in Kansas, Clara was washing dishes while Xander put the children to bed. She could hear him reading them a story, his voice rising and falling in the rhythm of the tale. She looked around the small kitchen, at the simple furniture and the curtains she had sewn, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Contentment, maybe, or peace. Xander came downstairs and wrapped his arms around her from behind. They are asleep. She leaned back into him. Already. Elizabeth fought it, but Thomas was tired. They stood like that for a moment, swaying slightly. Then Clara said, "Xander, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I am happy. I did not expect to be, but I am. This is not what I thought I wanted, but it feels right." She turned in his arms to face him. I love you and this life we are building." He smiled, that beautiful smile that still made her heart skip. "I love you too. I have loved you since the day you warned me not to let Tom Carmichael low-ball me on wages." She laughed. "That is a very specific moment to fall in love. It was when I realized you were not just beautiful. You were smart and sharp and kind, and you actually cared about a stranger's well-being. How could I not fall in love with you?" He kissed her, and the kiss deepened, became something more urgent. They stumbled toward the bedroom, shedding clothes, and made love for the first time in the small bed that had belonged to his brother. It was tender and awkward and perfect, and afterward they lay tangled together, breathless and laughing. "Marry me," Xander said. Clara propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What? Marry me?" "I know we have only known each other a few months, and I know this is not the romantic proposal you deserve. But Clara, I want you to be my wife. I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. I want to raise these children with you and maybe have some of our own someday. I want to build a life that matters, and I want to build it with you." She was crying again, but this time from pure joy. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." They were married a week later by a justice of the peace in Topeka, with Thomas and Elizabeth as witnesses. Clara wore a borrowed dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Elizabeth had picked. Xander wore his one good suit and could not stop smiling. After the ceremony, they took the children to a restaurant and ate fried chicken and pie, and for a few hours, they were just a normal family celebrating a happy occasion. The first year of their marriage was hard. Farming was backbreaking work and money was always tight. There were droughts and pests and months when Clara was not sure they would have enough to eat. But there were also good times, harvests that came in better than expected. Evenings spent playing cards with the children, winter nights when they lay together under layers of quilts and talked about their dreams. Clara started writing again, not poetry but practical articles about farm management and household economy. She sent them to newspapers in Kansas City and Denver, and to her shock, some of them were accepted. The money was not much, but it was hers, earned through her words and her mind. Xander built her a small desk in the corner of the parlor, and she would sit there in the mornings before the children woke, writing by lamplight. Thomas slowly began to heal. He would never be a carefree child, but he learned to smile again, and he attached himself to Xander with fierce loyalty. Elizabeth bloomed under Clara's attention, becoming a bright, curious girl who asked endless questions and loved to help in the kitchen. They started calling Clara Mama without prompting, and the first time it happened, Clara had to excuse herself and cry in the barn for 10 minutes. In the spring of their second year together, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Xander one evening after the children were asleep, and he picked her up and spun her around the kitchen, laughing with delight. The pregnancy was easy, and in December, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy with Xander's blue eyes and her auburn hair. They named him James, after Xander's brother. Life continued, a steady rhythm of work and family. Thomas grew into a lanky teenager who loved working the land. Elizabeth became a voracious reader who talked about becoming a teacher someday. James was a happy, noisy toddler who followed his siblings everywhere. And Clara and Xander grew deeper into their love, the kind of love that comes from building a life together through good times and hard times. One day, 5 years after they left Arizona, Clara received a letter from Mrs. Chen. The saloon had burned down in a fire, she wrote, but no one was hurt. Ash Fork was smaller than ever, barely more than a whistle stop. Most of the people Clara had known were gone. Mrs. Chen herself was moving to San Francisco to live with her daughter. Clara showed the letter to Xander that night. "It is strange," she said. "That part of my life feels like a dream now, like it happened to someone else." "Do you regret leaving?" he asked. She looked around their small farmhouse, at the kitchen where she had taught Elizabeth to make bread, at the parlor where they gathered in the evenings, at the stairs where she could hear Thomas reading to James. "No, not for a second. That town was where I was surviving. This is where I am living." He kissed her forehead. "I am glad you got on that train with me. So am I." The years continued to pass. Thomas married a girl from the neighboring farm and started his own place on land they helped him buy. Elizabeth went to normal school and became a teacher, just as she had dreamed. James grew into a serious boy who loved books and numbers. And Clara and Xander grew older together, their faces lined but their love undiminished. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xander brought Clara breakfast in bed, which made her laugh because they were farmers and farmers did not sleep past dawn. But he insisted, and she sat propped up on pillows, eating eggs and toast while he sat on the edge of the bed. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, beautifully made, with her initials embossed on the cover. "For your writing," he said. "You have been using those cheap notebooks from the general store. You deserve something better." She ran her fingers over the smooth leather, tears pricking her eyes. "Xander, this is too much. It is not nearly enough. You gave up your dreams for me and the children. The least I can do is give you a proper place to write new ones." "I did not give up my dreams," she said softly. "They just changed into something better than I imagined. I wanted to see the world and learn and write things that mattered. And I have, just in a different way than I expected." She had published dozens of articles over the years, in newspapers and farm journals across the country. She had taught 3 children to read and think and question. She had built a life with a man who saw her soul and loved it. It was not the life she had imagined in that dusty saloon in Arizona, but it was hers, and it was real, and it was enough. That night, they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the wheat fields. The air was cool and sweet with the smell of growing things. Xander's arm was around her waist and her head rested on his shoulder. "You remember the first time I came into the saloon?" he asked. "Of course. You asked for whiskey and information. I was so lost that day, drifting from place to place with no purpose. And then I saw you and everything changed. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something instead of just running. You did the same for me. I was trapped in that town, too scared to leave, too stubborn to stay. You showed me that I could be brave." He kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other." "Yes," she agreed. "We did." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Clara thought about the girl she had been, standing behind that bar in Ash Fork, pouring drinks for men who saw her as a prize to be won. She thought about how lonely she had been, how desperate for something she could not name. And then she thought about the man who had walked in and seen past the surface to the person beneath. The man who had listened when she talked about her dreams and told her she deserved to chase them. The man who had loved her not for what she could give him, but for who she was. In the end, it was not about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was about 2 people who found each other in a lonely place and decided to build something beautiful together. It was about the small daily choices to love and support and challenge each other. It was about creating a family and a home and a life that mattered. Clara Ramsey had been the last woman in a lonely town, and every cowboy had wanted her. But only one had seen her true soul. and in seeing her, he had helped her see herself. Together, they had built a love that would last all their days. 20 years later, Clara sat on the same porch, her hair now streaked with gray, and watched her grandchildren playing in the yard. Thomas had 3 children of his own, and Elizabeth had just had her first baby. James was courting a sweet girl from town. The farmhouse had been expanded over the years, with new rooms added as the family grew. Xander came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and settled into the chair next to hers. His hair was fully gray now and his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes were still sharp and kind. "Big family dinner tonight," he said. "Elizabeth is bringing her husband and the baby. Thomas said they would be here by 6. "I should start on the roast," Clara said, but she did not move. She was content to sit and watch the children play, their laughter floating on the warm summer air. "Remember when it was just us and Thomas and Elizabeth?" Xander asked. "This house felt too big then." "Now it feels too small," Clara said with a laugh, "but I would not change it for anything." He reached over and took her hand, his palm rough and familiar against hers. They sat like that for a long time, 2 people who had built a life together out of loneliness and hope and love. That evening, the house filled with family. The dining table was crowded with bodies and noise and food. Clara looked around at the faces of the people she loved, her children and their spouses, her grandchildren, and Xander at the head of the table, carving the roast with the same patient care he brought to everything. This was her legacy. Not the articles she had written or the saloon she had left behind, but this family, this love, this life. After dinner, when the children were playing outside and the adults were cleaning up, Elizabeth pulled Clara aside. "Mama, I found something in the attic the other day, a box of poems." "Did you write those?" Clara felt her face flush. "A long time ago, before I met your father. They are beautiful. Have you ever thought about publishing them?" "No, those were just for me, private thoughts." "I think you should. They deserve to be read." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "You are an amazing writer, Mama. You should not hide that." That night, Clara pulled out the old wooden box and read through the poems she had written in Ash Fork, in those lonely years before Xander. They were raw and aching, full of longing for a life she had not yet found. And then she pulled out the journal Xander had given her on their 10th anniversary, now filled with writings from the past decade, new poems about love and family, essays about the life she had built, reflections on becoming a mother and a wife and a woman who knew her own worth. She showed them to Xander, feeling vulnerable and exposed. He read them carefully, taking his time. "These are extraordinary," he said finally. "Clara, you should publish these, not in farm journals but in real literary magazines. These deserve to be read by people who love poetry." "I am 50 years old and a farmer's wife. Who would care? Anyone who reads these would care. You have a voice, Clara, a real voice. It is time to let people hear it." So she did. She compiled her best poems and essays and sent them to magazines in Chicago and New York. To her shock, they were accepted. Her work began appearing in publications she had only dreamed of reading when she was young. She received letters from readers telling her how her words moved them, how they saw themselves in her reflections on love and loss and finding home. At 53, Clara published her first book, a collection of poems and essays about life in the American heartland. It was not a bestseller, but it was well reviewed, and more importantly, it was hers. Xander threw her a party to celebrate, inviting everyone in town and all their family. Thomas gave a speech about how his mother had taught him that it was never too late to chase your dreams. Elizabeth cried. James presented her with a wooden plaque he had carved himself with her name and the book title. Clara stood in the middle of the crowded room, surrounded by the people who loved her, and thought about the long, strange journey that had brought her here. From that dusty saloon in Arizona to this farmhouse in Kansas. From loneliness to belonging. From surviving to thriving. Xander found her later when the party was winding down. He pulled her onto the porch away from the noise. "Are you happy?" he asked. She did not have to think about the answer. "More than I ever imagined possible." "Good, because you deserve all of it. Every bit of happiness and success and love." She kissed him, a long, slow kiss that held 30 years of partnership and passion. "I love you, Xander Moss. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when I did not believe in myself. You gave me a life worth living." "You did the same for me," he said. "I was just a drifter with no future until I met you. You gave me purpose. You gave me a family. You gave me everything." They stood together under the stars, older now but no less in love than they had been that first day under the cottonwood trees in Ash Fork. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every hard step. They had built something real and lasting, a love that had grown deeper with every passing year. Clara published 2 more books before she turned 60. She became known as a voice for rural women, for people who built lives in quiet places far from cities and universities. She spoke at churches and ladies' clubs, sharing her story and encouraging other women to pursue their dreams no matter their age or circumstances. And always, Xander was beside her, supporting and encouraging and loving her with a steadfastness that never wavered. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them. By then, Thomas had 5 children and Elizabeth had 4. James had married his sweetheart and had twin boys. The farmhouse could not hold everyone, so they set up tables in the yard and had a feast that lasted until the stars came out. Late in the evening, after the children had been put to bed and the adults were sitting around talking quietly, Elizabeth asked Clara to tell the story of how she and Xander met. "We have heard it a million times," Thomas protested, but he was smiling. "Tell it again," Elizabeth said. "I want the children to hear it when they are older." So Clara told the story, about being the last woman in a dying Arizona town, about the cowboys who saw her as a prize, about the quiet stranger who walked into the saloon one hot summer day and saw her true soul. She told them about the choice she made to get on that train, to take a chance on love even when it was terrifying. She told them about the hard early years, about learning to be a family, about building a life one day at a time. "The most important thing," Clara said, looking at her children and grandchildren, "is that love is not about possession. It is not about one person completing another. Real love is about seeing someone fully their strengths and flaws and dreams and fears, and choosing to walk beside them. Your father did that for me. He never tried to change me or diminish me. He saw who I was and loved me for it. That is the kind of love worth having." Xander squeezed her hand. She made it easy to love her. "No, I did not," Clara said with a laugh. "I was stubborn and scared, and I fought you every step of the way." "Exactly. Easy." He smiled at her, and the love in his eyes was as bright as it had been 40 years ago. As Clara looked around at the family they had built, at the children and grandchildren who existed because she had been brave enough to say yes to love, she felt a deep sense of completion. Her life had not turned out the way she expected, but it had turned out exactly the way it was supposed to. She had found her place in the world, not in a city with libraries and universities, but here on this Kansas farm with a man who had seen her soul. Years later, when Clara was 74 years old, Xander passed away peacefully in his sleep. Clara woke one morning to find him still and cold beside her, his face serene. She sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, memorizing the lines of his face, saying goodbye to the man who had been her partner for almost 50 years. The grief was overwhelming. The children rallied around her, and the house filled with family again, but there was a hollowness at the center of everything. She had lost half of herself, but she also knew that she had been extraordinarily lucky. They had had decades together, built a beautiful life, loved each other well. Not everyone got that. She had been given a gift, and she was grateful for every single day. She lived for another 8 years, surrounded by her growing family. She published one final book, a memoir about her marriage and the lessons she had learned about love and partnership. She watched her grandchildren grow into adults and welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. And every evening, she sat on the porch in the chair next to Xander's empty one and talked to him as if he were still there. She told him about the children and their accomplishments. She told him about the farm, which Thomas now ran. She told him about the sunset and the smell of the wheat fields and how the world kept turning without him. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she felt his presence beside her, felt the warmth of his love that had sustained her for so many years. Clara Ramsey Moss died on a spring morning with all her children and many of her grandchildren surrounding her bed. Her last words were for Xander, a whispered, "I am coming," my love that brought tears to every eye in the room. They buried her next to him in the small cemetery outside town. The entire community came to pay their respects to the woman who had taught so many people about strength and dignity and love. Elizabeth gave a eulogy about her mother's courage and her endless capacity for growth. Thomas spoke about the farm and the legacy she had built. James read from her poetry, his voice breaking with emotion. And later, when everyone had gone home, Elizabeth and her daughter stood at the grave. "Tell me again how they met," the granddaughter said. Elizabeth smiled through her tears and began the story. About a lonely town in Arizona and the last woman there. About cowboys who wanted her and one man who saw her soul. About a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The story lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that real love is about seeing and being seen. That it is never too late to be brave. That the greatest adventures often start with a simple choice to say yes. Clara had been the last woman in a lonely town and every cowboy had wanted her. But only one saw her true soul. And in that seeing, they had both found home.